Thank you very much, and what an imposing venue. I hope I can bring the energy sufficient to fill the space. Look, it's a great pleasure to be back again this year. It's really becoming for us in the Global Methane Hub an annual fixture. A lot of our partners and grantees in the room I see as it's a great opportunity for us to sit down and catch up in person and hear the latest advances, and also learn some new things, which is always an important part of the job. We don't know it all for sure. And to really acknowledge the ongoing support of the Department of Food and Agriculture, Virginia and team and Secretary, Spark Climate with Charles and Barrett, and probably numerous others behind the scenes. And of course, the university that's hosting us, Frank and Joe and the team. It's a great job you do putting this on for us each year, and it's a pleasure to be here. I wasn't sure exactly how to organize this session. I see there's a screen, so if the speakers aren't feeling too uncomfortable, I might even invite everybody up to sit with me while we hear each of you speak in turn. So to introduce the panel, first I'd like to invite Mr. Jamie Jonker, who's the Chief Science Officer at the National Milk Producers Federation, serving as the Federation's lead scientific expert on dairy, from animal health, sustainability to biosecurity, air and water quality, representing the US dairy industry and the International Dairy Federation, where he served as the chair of the science program coordinating committee from 2020 to 2025, and holding a Bachelor of Science, Master of Science from Cornell, and a PhD from University of Maryland. Welcome. And now Mr. Ruaraidh Petre, who is the Executive Director of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which he has led since 2012. That's quite a tenure, Ruaraidh. Time to... Under his direction, GRSB has advanced international sustainability goals for the beef value chain, including climate neutrality, animal welfare, and resilient rural livelihoods. Originally from Scotland and trained as an agricultural engineer, Ruaraidh has built his career across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Oceania, and farming systems and responsible livestock production. Welcome, Ruaraidh. And unfortunately, but not to say unfortunately for you, Aimable, but unfortunately, the final speaker on today's panel, Dr. Aimable Uwizeye from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, who leads work on low emissions, climate resilient livestock systems, supporting stronger nationally determined contributions from the countries parties to the Paris Agreement, integrating livestock climate commitments into national policy. He has 13, well, it says 13 plus, we won't say how many more, but at least 13 years experience advancing methane reduction via roadmaps, inventories, capacity building, and climate finance, developing guidance for carbon markets also, which is a new thing we're going to hear about, I'm sure. Holds a Diploma of Veterinary Medicine, dual master's degree, and a PhD from Wageningen University. Welcome. And I said unfortunately, and that was just to acknowledge that Professor Anthony Whitbread was going to also be with us, but he is unable to travel due to getting malaria, of all things. So we wish Anthony all the best in his recovery in Tanzania. So this is the panel for today, and I think the first speaker to invite would be Jamie, if you're prepared. Thank you.
Great, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. And I was asked to speak on behalf of the International Dairy Federation. Some of you may know who the International Dairy Federation is, but let me set a little bit of context so you can understand why the International Dairy Federation is part of the conference here today. IDF was established in 1903. It has 40 member countries that produce around 2/3 of the milk production in the world. It's not just dairy cattle, it's water buffalo, sheep, goats, camels, horses, donkeys, reindeer, yak. And we are an organization that has long-term accreditation with international intergovernmental bodies like the Food and Agricultural Organization in the United Nations, the Environmental Program of the United Nations, World Organization for Animal Health, and others. We also do collaborations with international governmental organizations from around the world. We are what I consider, the leading scientific and technical arm of the global dairy sector. And we've been involved in looking at sustainability in the dairy sector for a long time. We're going to focus on a few things that we've done here more recently. And recently is in the eye of the beholder. Things that the dairy sector has done, starting with the Global Dairy Agenda for Action in 2009, 17 years ago already. The Dairy Sustainability Framework in 2013. Our first IDF Dairy Declaration of Rotterdam on dairy sustainability. Pathways to Net Zero that we're a partner in 2021. The Global Methane Pledge that we've committed ourselves to in 2022. And then in 2024, at the World Dairy Summit held in Paris, we had the Paris Dairy Declaration on Sustainability signed by the IDF and FAO. And it's a global commitment to sustainable dairy development with public, quantified, and time-tabled objectives. We've called on our members around the world and its leaders and stakeholders to endorse the Declaration on Sustainability. And I think it's important to recognize that sustainability is not just greenhouse gases. It's the entire economic viability of the sector and everyone that's involved, from the primary producer that may be in India with 2 water buffalo or 2 cows, to that vertically integrated 30,000 cow dairy farm in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. But today we're speaking on greenhouse gases and very specifically methane. It's important first that we know what our emissions are. Without having accurate measurement, it's really difficult to understand where we should reduce, how we can reduce, and if we are actually reducing. So a foundation from the IDF perspective has been our LCA methodology and carbon footprinting. That's a foundation that we have to have before we can start taking action, so we know what our emissions are, where they're occurring, so that we can then focus on strategies for reducing those emissions. Of course, methane is important because we have that wonderful rumen in most of our animals, perhaps not in our horses and donkeys, but it's amazing. We convert materials that are undigestible or mostly undigestible by humans into high value animal proteins, fats, 13 different nutrients that dairy is an important part of our diet around the globe. But after we measure and understand where our emissions are coming from, we need to have practical tools, things that can be implemented on the farm in the areas where our emissions come from. In the US, about 1/3 is from the dairy cow, about another 1/3 is from our manure management systems, 20% or so from our feed, and the other 10%, the rest of the value chain. So I've mentioned that IDF, Scientific and Technical Organization, we published our first carbon footprinting bulletin back more than a decade ago in 2015. We had our IDF Global Footprint published in 2022, and we have a carbon sequestration guidelines that were published in 2022 as well. Why am I here? Mostly I'm here because the Director General, Lawrence Reichen, for IDF was unavailable to participate today. But I do lead a task force that was recently started at the International Dairy Federation, which is a road mapping exercise, looking at what has the organization already done in greenhouse gas mitigation. What are we working on? What are we missing? What are other people doing in this space? We collaborate with a lot of different organizations, as I mentioned and when I first talked about what IDF is. And we need to make sure as we go through this process that we don't duplicate what others are doing, that we complement what others are doing, but that we have a clear roadmap for helping to put in place and fulfill our own objectives that IDF has, which we've just recently updated for 2026 to 2030. Including sustainability, including greenhouse gas mitigation, including addressing methane. And so what do we have? We need to reduce our methane from where it occurs, and we need to continue to increase the dairy products that the global market needs, because we have increasing consumption, particularly in developing countries. And it's not one size fits all. While the principles may be the same, we have very different systems: intensive, extensive. We have animals that are milking north of the Arctic Circle. We have animals that are milking in the desert. We have pastoral systems. We have intensive systems. And we must look at progress in the light of food security, livelihoods, and local realities. We can't address methane and greenhouse gas emissions simply in a vacuum. We have to look at what we are asking our dairy producers to do in the differing contexts around the world in manners that not only address methane emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, but also actually help contribute to the betterment of their livelihoods and the betterment of food security and the ability to have dairy proteins and dairy fats and dairy products available around the world. Animal care is part of that strategy. I put this slide in here because we are now in our third year of highly pathogenic avian influenza in the US dairy sector. From the period of March 24 to March 25, it reduced the US dairy production by 1%. 1% doesn't seem like a lot, but if we were to look at where that was localized, a lot of it here in California, very impactful for those dairy farmers. And when you think about asking dairy farmers during an animal health crisis to continue to work on their abilities to reduce their methane emissions, it can be challenging. And that 4 or 5% reduction in milk production in California over that period of time means that their emissions intensity probably increased. And that's what can happen when we have these perturbations that come in. So things that we can do to keep animal health front and foremost means that the animals are healthier, they're producing milk, they're producing saleable milk. And so I talked a little bit about how we need to have things that look at the different places where emissions occur, and that we need to put it in the context of what can be done locally. So this is a methane digesting system here in the US. They may look different from farm to farm, but you can kind of see the scale of that. The one on my right, your left, that's in India. That's a methane digester that's at a local milking facility. There's a very different scale there, but the underlying technology is not all that different. So the principles are the same. It's just the application that you have to put it in place in differing dairy production systems may be different. And in India, I was able to go to an Aimable dairy plant in Gujarat, where they have a methane digester where they're bringing manure in from different villages, where they're collecting it from individual farms, and they're using that methane digester to do CNG into vehicles. There are methane digesters here in California where they're scrubbing it and putting that CNG into pipelines. It's not all that different, even though it may look different from place to place. And so again, I just want to reemphasize that greenhouse gas reduction, methane reduction, is not a single metric for sustainability. We have to look at the environment and where dairy is being produced in every country around the world, even in the US, in every state in Puerto Rico. We need to look at the nutrition that dairy brings to the global diet. Then we have to look at the livelihoods of those that are involved in the production processes, from the primary producer all the way through the dairy value chain. And so that means progress comes from credible measurement, practical action, and continuous improvement. We are, as a global dairy sector, acting on methane. We are reducing our greenhouse gas intensity. We need to make sure as we do these things that we're protecting the environment where our farmers are operating and the nutritional value that comes from the dairy products that their animals produce. They're therefore keeping dairy farms viable and resilient. And with that, I probably spent more time than I should have. Thank you.
No, you didn't. You were really great on time. So, and we have plenty of time because we're one panelist down. Right, before I introduce the next speaker to come up here, I just want to mention you may have seen some QR codes on the tables. I think the one on the right-hand side is for the Slido app that perhaps you're familiar with. So if you feel like scanning a QR code, it should take you to the app, or I guess you can go on the website, which would be http:// line, you know, the usual thing with sli.do, Slido, but a dot between the sly and the do. That would take you to the website, and then if you do hashtag, let me get the right directions here. Hashtag SOTS, right? State of the Science. That would take you to the page for this particular conference. So that is probably the most efficient means for you to ask questions to the speakers or to the panel as a whole. If you don't want to use the technology, your option would be raise your hand and yell from where you are, because we don't have mics to roam around the room. So if you send the question through Slido, I'll do my best to package those up and ask the panel, or you can by all means raise your hand and we can get to you as well in the old school way. And I think is there anything else to say just quickly? No, I think that's it. So with that, Rory, your turn. Welcome.
Thanks, Hayden. I was just wondering how many people in here didn't have a telephone with them. That would be quite a surprise. So thank you for inviting me. And if I click here, yep. Thank you so much for inviting me. I am, as Hayden said at the beginning, the Executive Director of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, something that for the past 6 weeks I'd been kind of avoiding because I took a long break, which was really fantastic. I got the opportunity to walk from one side of Scotland to the other in conditions which varied between sort of nice sunny days to blizzards. But it was fantastic. And during that walk, I saw probably about 20 acres of arable land. Scotland is not a place where we grow a huge amount of crops. We've got a fair bit of arable land down the east coast, but the central part and all of the west is very much livestock producing country. And it's where I come from. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we need to talk about solutions for the livestock industry, because the livestock industry is essential to livelihoods and to food supply in so many parts of the world where we just can't grow human edible crops. So that's why all those years ago, we established the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, because we recognized there were huge challenges facing beef production. And there were problems with beef production in many different ways. Funnily enough, when we started in 2010, we actually started the initial discussions. The main thing on the agenda was not methane. It's hard to imagine today because it's all we ever hear about. And so I probably like to take a slightly broader view of things where possible. And I could just really repeat everything that Jamie said and kind of be done with it. So in a way, I could just say, okay, what he said, but replace milk with beef and then move on. But that would be a waste of the airfare, I think. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what GRSB is and what we do. GRSB was established to lead, enable, and communicate sustainability of the beef industry. And what do we mean by lead? Basically, we bring together all of the important people, organizations, from producers, processors, input providers, off-takers, retailers, others, people with an interest like NGOs and so on. We bring them all together to come up with solutions that work for the chain and for society in general. That's the big idea. And we do that now in 23 countries. So we haven't been going nearly as long as the International Dairy Federation. So we haven't reached 40 yet, but we have reached around about 2/3 of the global cross-border trade in beef. That would not include national trade in beef in places like Brazil. But we have a very active Brazilian roundtable. We have national initiatives, as I said, in 23 countries organized into 13 roundtables. And they have the same structure as we do. So Global Roundtable has about 80 direct members. But all of those countries have some similar numbers or more in their own country. So in the US, and we'll be hearing from Sam either tomorrow or the next day, Sam Worth, she can tell you about the huge representation you've got here in the US roundtable from the beef industry here in the United States. And they're all committed in the same way to sustainability solutions. And it's not limited by any means to greenhouse gases, but obviously that has become a sort of huge issue for us. So enabling, what did we do? We set up our principles and our criteria for sustainable beef to sort of give a framework. What are we actually working on? We try to provide materials which are going to provide the foundation for people to work practically on things. So just like the International Dairy Federation, we have produced this carbon footprint guideline. And in fact, it's directly compatible with the IDF one because it was developed by the same team at Blanc. And that means that if you've got beef on dairy, or if you've got dairy animals entering the beef herd, those two things work together and you can make it work seamlessly. And then the third one on there is communicating more outwards to the rest of the world, because not everybody has the confidence and the faith that I do in the sustainable beef industry. We have to be able to communicate to others that we can make beef more sustainable and that there are concrete things that we are doing and that we can be doing more of. So healthy herds for sustainable production is my sort of hobby horse, because animal health is a huge part of this, and maybe we'll hear more about that from Aimable, but animal health is one of the huge contributors. And while you may not see that as much in a developed country like the United States, if you go to the whole continent of Africa or much of Asia, where 2/3 of the large ruminants are, Africa and Asia, they have far bigger problems accessing animal health, preventative health. And as you all know, in the United States, an ounce of prevention can save you from a pound of cure. And with screwworm, I think you're seeing that today. The program that was canceled that was keeping screwworm out of the United States cost a few $1 million. The cost of having screwworm in the United States is going to probably cost you well over $1 billion. So the next thing we did to lead on sustainability was set some goals, because clearly if you don't have a goal, you're not going to be able to measure your progress. So we set these goals, and they are on 3 very related things. I like to think of these 3 areas that we set our goals in as different facets of the same, I guess, what is that, a pyramid, or a 3-sided triangle. They all contribute to the same goal in the end. They're all parts of the same system. And that's what sustainability is about. It's about a holistic approach to improving things, not focusing only on one. So while climate is hugely important, if you think about animal health and welfare and reducing the incidence of disease, in doing that, you're going to be reducing the emissions intensity of producing beef, and you're going to be reducing the land take. So similarly, working on nature positive, another thing that we've produced is a set of global metrics for measuring nature positive production. If you're working on nature positive production, you can be at the same time, through improved soil health, greater grass productivity, reducing emissions from that system and potentially improving the health and welfare of the cattle in that system. So they're all very closely related, and I think that's probably obvious to all of you, but it's something we have to say just to remind people on a regular basis. This Aimable will be very familiar with. It does actually have, oh, well, hopefully you can see on your version better than I can see on this one, that this is an FAO figure, and it's taken directly from their methane mitigation publication in 2023. And what I think is interesting about it is that most of the things here, which we can see as mitigation measures, so the ones on the waterfall side, if you like, they're all pretty practical things, and they're all things that we already know a lot about and are doing a lot of. So animal health is there, genetics is there, feed is there, you know, all of the things that basically are good husbandry, good management, you know, good production. If you're in business, these are the things you should be doing anyway. Because if you're not doing them, you're leaving money on the table and you're also losing efficiency. So the first thing that when I saw this, it was released at COP, I guess in 2023, since that's the date on it. The first thing I thought when I saw that was, well, that's great news, because we know a lot of this already. And all we actually need to do is invest more in making sure that this happens more widely. And it's bizarre, because even in the United States, in the UK, in Europe, in countries where we think, okay, we should have most of this sorted, we don't. Vaccination percentages are really appallingly low, even in developed countries, in wealthy countries. We need to improve that, but we also need to invest in making sure that access in lower income countries improves, because for 90% of the animals that are more than an hour from a vet are in lower income countries. So we need another solution for those countries. We need to be able to provide access. We need to be able to make sure that people are actually getting what they need into their animals to improve the health and the welfare and the productivity. And then just a few of the sort of practical examples to run through. If we could improve that global vaccination rate, we'd increase our up to 60%, which again is not, it's not what we want. We want even more than that. But if we could do that already, we'd have increased productivity by 50%. So these are huge figures. And the same for reducing animal disease by 1%. You're going to feed another 300 million people. And in a world where more than 800 million are hungry, every 1% of animal disease reduction we can do is going to make a significant impact on the number of people who go hungry. Yeah, it's obvious again. It's probably already been said today, even though only 2 people have spoken. But, if we've got better health and better productivity in our cattle, they'll take up less land. Parasites. Well, I just mentioned the example here in the US of screwworm, but parasites globally are a huge issue. And again, not a complicated thing to prevent and to treat. It requires investment, it requires extension, it requires the provision of infrastructure, but it's not rocket science. These are things we know how to do. Breeding technologies, adoption of AI in the beef industry is really low compared to the dairy industry and also compared to other livestock industries. We're leaving a huge amount of productivity on the table because we're not adopting technologies which, again, aren't rocket science. We've been doing this for 70 years or more. And yeah, genetics as well. If you're not using AI, it means you're not getting the best genetics. You're just getting what you bought at the barn, the sale barn. So definitely we can improve disease resistance. We can have better adapted animals to our environment. We can have animals which are weaning healthier. We can have animals which are doing better before they ever get to a feed yard. And as a result, again, we've increased productivity, we've increased profitability. And then here's an example from Africa, just on the emissions side from East Coast fever. We would increase our productivity by 27% while reducing emissions by 40%, just by vaccinating against that one disease. And there are many such diseases in every country around the world. It requires investment. And I guess my one sort of thing that I wish we would have done more of with GRSB over the last 12 to, 16 years, if we count the sort of count the startup phase, was really getting into some of those lower income countries and helping provide the investment for the infrastructure and the services that are needed. Because really, that's where demand's growing. That is where people are responding to increasing demand by increasing herd size instead of increasing productivity. So these are the countries we really need to be investing in to make sure that we're making a difference to emissions, to productivity, and to food supply. And I don't know how I'm doing for time, Hayden, but that's pretty much all I had to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Rory. For those who joined while Rory was speaking and didn't hear me talk about the Slido, there is some QR codes on the tables if you want to use those, or you can go to slide.do and use hashtag SOTS to join the Q&A that will follow the last presentation, and for those online as well. Right, Aimable, floor is yours.
So good afternoon. I hope you can hear me very well. Good. So today I will try not to talk a lot about methane, but I will mention methane as well. But what I want to do is mainly navigate on what we really need, which is the transformation of livestock sector. I'm very honored to be here, and I have been at the summit since the first one, actually. And I want just to start this by saying that we know that we have solutions that works very well, but we know that the science is clear. We have the technology, as my fellow speakers just mentioned. We know that policy is also emerging, but of course, we need to bring those action on the ground. So I will focus on implementation in my talk on scaling livestock methane mitigation, and of course, how we move from commitments to action on the ground. To start this, I want just to start with the good news. The good news is that FAO has recently, our member countries, have agreed for the first time ever on a global plan of action on sustainable livestock transformation. This has never happened before, where countries come together to discuss and agree on a single framework on how to move sector in the future. So this is a no binding and a voluntary framework, but it has been country driven. The process has involved many countries in the consultation, and each single line of this document has been negotiated by members. So this framework is a shared global framework, but of course country driven, and it is built around the 4 priority areas: food security, nutrition, and healthy diets, animal health through One Health approach, better livelihood and inclusive economic growth, and natural resource use, climate change, and biodiversity. The framework is quite interesting because it has around 17 strategic actions and more than 80 actions. So here I want to just talk about one, which is the natural resource use, climate change, and biodiversity. Under this framework, what members want to achieve: better feed, better animal health, better genetics, and better land and soil management. And of course, we need to reduce emissions in terms of especially the strategic priority 4.2 on enhancing adaptation to and mitigation of climate change in the livestock sector. So this is an important achievement. Of course, for those familiar with FAO process, this document will be finally adopted by all countries during the Committee on Agriculture in July, the 3rd week of July. And we expect that after this adoption, of course, it will be a guiding book for all stakeholders, especially countries needed to support the implementation and the transformation of the livestock systems. So, translating from global ambition to national actions and moving to the ground, what this requires partnership with governments, research, private sector, and producers' organizations. Of course, governments will lead, they will set policies. Researchers will inform, develop evidence. Private sector will scale. And of course, farmers must adopt those solutions to make change. So if farmers are not taking actions, it's really difficult to achieve what we want. So we can really do good innovation, but we need to bring innovation on the ground. From small scale producers to large scale producers, they all need those solutions. And I think my colleagues also mentioned that. So, oh, something happened. Okay, it's coming back. I hope I'm not, so now it's not working. Okay, so now it's working. So how we translate those global ambitions to national actions? Of course, we need investment. Investments can go towards livestock development objectives, improving productivity. I think my colleagues mentioned that. But of course, we need to integrate methane as a co-benefit. Methane reduction is a co-benefit. It's always difficult to make a huge investment targeting methane alone. So it should be a co-benefit. And that co-benefit should go in line by increasing productivity, increasing profitability for farmers, but of course, enhancing the access of farmers to the market. So far in FAO, we have worked with more than 48 countries to integrate methane reduction within their national policies. And we are pushing toward more accessing the finance they need to implement that on the ground. There is always, in any summit, I mention data. We cannot achieve any progress without robust data. So we need robust measurement, reporting, and verification, and they should be transparent, accessible, and of course, farmers must be the first data providers. So if we cannot have robust data, we can do all the efforts, but the achievement, we are not able to track and monitor. So that's why this is very important to support the MRV systems. And of course, we need the evidence on how policies and the collaboration with many stakeholders is shaping the methane reductions. So we should not only mention it while in our speech, but we should demonstrate on the ground that we are working together to reduce this. And I think California is a good example where methane reduction has been achieved with a huge support and collaboration among the industry and also the Californian government. And we see currently around the world that the country are moving with much more ambitious inventories using much more developed methodology, which is a good news. But of course, the challenge is the data behind it. So the problem is not the engine. The problem is the fuel we are using. So we really need to improve the data. So carbon markets. So in FAO, we have started a global expert panel to develop the technical guidelines on voluntary and compliant carbon markets in the livestock sector. Why? Because we believe carbon markets can help farmers to adopt best practices and can generate additional incomes for farmers. However, to achieve this, we need an initial investment. So we need more carbon finance or climate finance. But we know that once we have strong MRVs, carbon markets will be much more credible, they will be much more transparent and inclusive, and they will help us to transform the livestock sector. At FAO, we have developed models. One of them is this global livestock environment assessment model that has been with us for many years. But this time, the model is changing. So we are kind of liberalizing, providing access to everybody to this model to use. So now the global livestock environment assessment model GRIM is available online. It can be accessible. It can be co-developed because we have released the core code of the model so that to allow countries and stakeholders really to have much more stronger MRVs. And so far, we have seen a huge interest in the accessing the GRIM model, which is available on GitHub, is available also on our Crane, and it can be co-developed. So we are not putting any restriction to the use. Actually can be croned and further developed because we released the core code. So this is very important because so far we have been criticized that our core engine is not accessible. So we're not so transparent. But I think this is our contributions to make sure that what we do is very transparent. To finalize this, I want to leave you with a couple of key messages, if they can appear on the screen. I'm having an issue with the remote. Okay, good. Here we go. So I want to leave you with a few messages. First, the Global Plan of Action on Sustainable Livestock is establishing a strong foundation because this is an agreement between countries, although voluntary and non-binding, but we believe that all countries from small islands to bigger livestock producers, they will find the priorities and the actions outlined in that document to guide further policies, data, and investment. However, transforming livestock systems and reducing emissions require collaboration among stakeholders. We need to work together with governments, researchers, private sector, farmers organization to ensure that we are bringing solution on the ground. Again, robust MRVs. I will repeat this because we see the challenge that when we don't communicate transparently the emissions, of course, we are not credible. So having robust MRVs will help us to be much more transparent, and it will increase our integrity and our credibility to achieve what we want, especially reducing enteric emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why we need the science-based tools to measure progress and also to unlock climate finance. Finally, carbon markets and the climate finance, as well as other no-market mechanisms, are very important because farmers need incentives, and incentives can help to adopt best practices. So those incentives should not be always subsidies. They can be market-driven. So that's why we believe that carbon markets can be one of a lever that we can explore to bring much more income to farmers and also to motivate farmers to do the recording, because we need to get daily data on farm. It's challenging, especially when we talk about small scale. There are many millions of them, but it's the only way we can achieve sustainability if we are able to measure the impact on the ground. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. So while Barrett's bringing me this contraption to manage the Slido, I'm going to ask some questions myself. And reminder that you can ask via the Slido app or the website, or you can just raise your hand and raise your voice when it comes to your turn. But I had just a question for each of the speakers that came to mind and wonder if they might expand on. So Jamie first, you mentioned it, the International Dairy Federation's methodological reports, the life cycle assessments, carbon footprinting, publications that you've produced over the years have kind of become standards, right, for obviously for the dairy sector, but also have been utilized by other accounting frameworks as the basis for estimating emissions within dairy value chains. And I'm curious in terms of thinking not only about the baselining, right, quantifying emissions from a system, but thinking about the mitigation options that would be available for farmers and different dairy production systems around the world. What is the current work taking place in IDF to actually make possible the mitigation, right, via manure management or breeding or inhibitors or whatever technologies? Just curious, is there a pipeline of development occurring within IDF to bring to bear specific methods for the mitigation actions themselves to complement the existing underlying baseline?
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, so IDF is a standards and guidelines type of organization. So we don't look at commercializing products and processes ourselves, but what we do look at is how can we help evaluate those. So an example, we're working with the International Committee on Animal Recording, which we've done for many decades. First starting off with how do we accurately record the milk production that's coming from cows, and then the milk production and the components. So our continued work with them is looking at how do we utilize sensor data for animal health, because there's lots of different systems that are in the marketplace. They each have their own capabilities. How do you compare one system to another? Working with ICAR, how can we help bring about a better understanding about how these animal health sensors work, and so that when a dairy farmer is using them, they can make a determination who they might want to use and why, and how that helps them become better managers of their animals, improving their animal health. And as you've heard, animal health has an impact on productivity, which has an impact on greenhouse gas intensity, which is part of that process of reducing our overall emissions by producing more with less. And so that's just one example of how we do that. I think the other part I'll add to this is we have with our LCA methodology, each country typically is going to be utilizing their own model. We have a process within IDF that models can be compared to that LCA methodology, so that when the U.S. Dairy sector, which has put money behind using the RUFIS system, ruminant farm animal systems, through our National Dairy Farm Program, we can look at what South Africa is doing, what New Zealand is doing, what Ireland is doing, so that we know that our models are working in the same manner. Now, if we plug our data into somebody else's model, the outcome might be a little different, but we know that we're working to the same ideals, so that when we look at in our own sectors within individual countries or even within subregions in a country, that we're evaluating technologies, where's the biggest bang for our buck today versus what might we want to look at investing for future tech. We have that opportunity.
Thank you. Rory, you mentioned, you observed that a lot of the measures that were in the waterfall chart that FAO published a few years ago were kind of good old animal husbandry. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what is it about climate change mitigation, or methane specifically, that can help have good old animal husbandry implemented at scale when it hasn't been achieved already? You know, you made the point that it's already kind of in the interest of producers, it's, you know, leaving money on the table and so on. So what do you think the climate angle is that might help us get there?
Yeah, that's a important question. One of the things is that climate is not just something that's impacted by emissions from every sector, but it's also something that directly impacts production, food production. And I think a large number of producers are very aware of that. You know, they're seeing changes already, and they're aware that their production system is in threat. So that might be one extra piece in the puzzle to say, well, okay, things need to be done more efficiently and better, certainly in terms of soil and the productivity of your grasslands, but also in general, the idea that there could be carbon markets will be another driver for producers if they see that there are incentives to change their management. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is easy, but I think that we have underinvested in extension and the provision of services to the livestock industry chronically for decades. If we look at overseas direct investment and overseas assistance, if you like, into agriculture, over 90% of that has gone into crop agriculture, and a remaining small percentage into animal agriculture, which is spread between a number of species. So we have chronically underinvested. We need to invest more. That's really my take-home message. Of course, when we have other markets that can provide a sort of additional incentive, that's just a sort of extra cherry on the cake.
Thank you. And Aimable, the global plan of action. Yeah, I had some time in FAO, like not as an employee, but as a government representative, and I know how that process works, or sometimes doesn't work when the members misbehave. And I also know effectively, like that document can kind of trace itself back 15 years to initial conversations to try and create a space for livestock, which some years later, probably 10, resulted in the subcommittee, and then that product is now available for the Committee on Agriculture to adopt, hopefully without edits and without discontent. So it's a long process. So congratulations to get there. You mentioned it's a voluntary guideline for people, but I'm curious, when COAG adopts that document, what does that change about the way FAO works? Does that significantly change budget allocations, the way you operate in terms of the actual organization, or is it more for the members and their use?
Thank you, Hayden. And so it's a trick question, but I will try to answer without being too diplomatic. So, but what it means that the document has been developed for members, so for countries to adopt. So it's a country-driven process that country negotiated. So, and of course, the first responsibility will be for countries to implement based on their national context. So what is requested to FAO is that FAO will assist the members to implement the document upon their request. So we expect countries to ask FAO to support. So of course, that will also has implication in terms of budget, because of course, some of our existing program, like what we call technical cooperation program, will be directed towards certain priorities that will be aligned with the national development plans, especially that is expected that each country will develop the national action plans for the sustainable livestock transformation. So the other aspect is that most of those decisions, we do implement them through what we call voluntary contributions. So meaning under project. So not really under the core budget of FAO, because the core budget of FAO is too little to support many countries. But the biggest operational budget of FAO is extra budgetary, meaning that is project-based and donor-based. So usually that's what is expected, and they are quite good signals. That's how it will go.
Thank you. Okay, so looking at Slido, there's a lot of anonymous questions here, so no one's very brave. I'm going to merge a couple here. This is to both Jamie and Rory, and it relates to I guess the difference between the productivity-oriented interventions that we know can have an impact on reducing emissions intensity, and thinking more about direct mitigation of methane, right? And the kind of combined question here would be, how are you both communicating the need for the direct mitigation in addition to the good old animal husbandry, to use Rory's terminology? And what role do your respective organizations play or could play in supporting innovation for direct mitigation beyond the animal husbandry? And I guess particularly for the hard to reach animals, the ones that are far from contact, particularly grazing systems, which we all know are challenging. So in any order, whoever wants to go first. Rory.
Okay. Okay, so, well, at least now I don't have to follow you and say, well, he already said it. But for us, we have quite a few members who are involved directly in the production of products that will mitigate methane directly when administered to cattle, mostly, as you say, in a confined situation. But there are also members who are working on products that will be more useful in a grazing situation. So we, obviously our members are all aware of this, and we try to disseminate information about this, but we're not directly pushing a product or a selection of products for people to use. We're making them aware that these things exist and that our members are involved in their production. One of those things is also a vaccine, by the way, that, getting closer to having at least a partially effective vaccine, which should last for about 6 months. So that would be much more useful in a grazing situation than any of the feed additives. And then there are a number of boluses which members are working on, and which could be effective for, again, periods of weeks or months rather than a day at a time. But we're not, a bit like IDF, we're not directly pushing any product or selection of products on our members. At the national roundtable level, they have more refined targets for what they're doing. And some of our members are implementing these technologies in their production systems, and they are used as examples. So we share those examples with other members, but we're not directly advising people on using them.
So I get to say back to you now, basically, what you said is what I'm going to say, but I'll say it a little differently. And I'll start with what you ended on, which is that sharing of information. So within IDF, we have differing forums where we can share information on different aspects of production, including the use of differing technologies that can reduce methane emissions. So we have an annual dairy sustainability report that basically is publishing like case studies. We have an annual World Dairy Summit where we have multi-tracks that are focusing on sustainability, greenhouse gas mitigation. Again, sharing information. We have relationships with places like Codex, and think about something like feed additives, where there may be a concern about potential for carryover residues. That could be something that could be brought forth through the Codex Committee on Residues of Veterinary Drugs, CCR-VDF, Codex Committee on Residues of Veterinary Drugs. And so there's differing places where IDF kind of has that role. But again, because we're not a primary technology producer, rather a more of a standards and guidelines type of organization, and information sharing, we're much more on that information sharing side. We have a dairy farmers roundtable at our World Dairy Summit each year, and climate change, sustainability, including the economic viability of their sector, of their individual farms for needing to put in technology for absolute reductions, is a hot topic. And so those are just types of different venues that we're able to share that type of information without saying product A will get you 27% of the way there, product B will only do 9%. It's not our role to be that stamp of approval or disapproval for products. That's the role for regulatory processes and international intergovernmental agreements, so that we can have trade of products. If we're using technology in one country that's not being used in another, if the product's safe, you still have that trade of animal and animal products.
Thank you. This is to Aimable. To understand maybe a bit more detail what FAO is doing in low and middle income countries, to to empower smallholder farmers in particular, which I guess are the dominant scale of farming in those countries, to record data that would be helpful in measuring progress, and how that would then enable them to have perhaps direct access to finance, carbon markets or otherwise. Just speak a bit more about the day-to-day job you're doing within countries.
Thank you. I think this is a very important aspect, because one of the actions we are doing on ground, in particular, we are engaging with the National Statistics Office to make sure that they can improve the data they collect on livestock. Because usually they often collect on animal numbers and production, nothing else. So that's very important, because we want to make sure that the approach we are using at country level is sustainable. So we want to make sure that at least some national institutions will uptake the support and continue to do that. The second aspect, we are looking at the producer organizations and also some champion that could continue to record the information with piloting farms. So we can give an example. In Costa Rica has a very interesting measurement, reporting, verification systems. They have around 3,000 farmers involved in data collection system across the countries. And every year, data is collected across all those farms. And that information is the one used to do the national greenhouse gas emission inventory, for example, and also provide advisory to the Ministry of Agriculture and the Livestock on the action to take on environmental sustainability. So at FAO, what we have been doing was to support Costa Rica to align and harmonize the type of the data they collect, because when we did the audit or the evaluation of the systems, we find out that each region had its different questionnaire. So therefore, sometimes the data were not speaking to each other. So that had helped a lot, because before they were using only 300 farms data, rather than using 3,000. Because of that issues on the system that was not harmonized. So we helped the country to harmonize the systems. And of course, we also help through another project, which is more looking at soil carbon sequestration to help farmers measure soil carbon. Because Costa Rica has a very good scheme in incentivizing farmers to increase soil carbon sequestration. So that's FAO is working closely with the Ministry of Environment to continue monitor, for example, the soil carbon sequestration, which is another kind of added initiative through what we call the soil system.
So in a previous job, I ran a veterinary program covering the whole of Afghanistan. And I can tell you that it's much easier to gather information from small-scale producers when you're providing them a service. So we had a network of paravets that worked across the whole country in conjunction with FAO and other partners. We provided them with training and with all of the vaccines, etc. they needed. And as a result, they had access to pretty much every livestock keeper in the country. And without a functioning government, Afghanistan clearly didn't have a statistics department, but we had a network of paravets who could provide us with a livestock census based on vaccination numbers. And this is really cheap. Like, we were doing this for a couple of $1 million a year. So, you know, we need to think beyond just government structures and think about what can we do with limited resources to actually reach people far out in the countryside.
Okay, I'll merge another couple. Remember, if you want to ask a question from the floor, you're more than welcome. Ash. So to repeat that for everybody in case you couldn't hear, it's given the global headwinds that exist in all manner and form currently, how can we ensure that the importance of methane doesn't just completely fall off the agenda? Any panelists want to reflect on that? And look, there's a question. There's a question here as well, which is similar, which speaks to when administrations and governments aren't necessarily climate forward, let's call it, how to approach these things in order to maintain momentum. So it's a similar one. And then maybe looking at the positive side, there's another question which I'll just wrap in is, are there any regions or countries that you see out there on your work where there are good sort of incentives and conditions for action to be taken? So kind of bring that all together and go to Jamie first.
Let's see how much trouble I can get myself in. That's a question with so many landmines. So I think when I look at it from the dairy sector, I think what we have is setting aside whether there's government interest or not in reducing greenhouse gases and methane. I think there's generally a global dairy sector commitment to this. And when we look at whether it's in the developing world or the developed world, our dairy value chain recognizes the risk that greenhouse gas is causing. And so it's if the value chain is part of that process that is driving the need for making changes in our dairy operations and driving innovation that can lead to scalability of action, whether it's looking at the genetics to breed a lower methane cow, or the vaccine for that Rory mentioned. The sector is really kind of driving that outside of whether or not there is government incentive or pressure to do so. Now, changes in how governments operate certainly will have an impact on that. I think the California dairy sector, for example, has kind of a double-edged sword with the state government. A lot of pressure on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I hear a lot about the California Air Resources Board sometimes from my members. But at the same time, you just heard tonight an additional $34 million being put into the sector. So there's also the government incentives to help make those changes. And so you can have interesting political climates. They will change over time, and the issue of greenhouse gas emissions, the effects on climate don't disappear just because political will changes from time to time.
Yeah, I see the same in the beef sector. I mean, not even actually, particularly in the United States, I would say that since there has been obviously a change in the attitude of the government to sustainability in general and greenhouse gases in particular, I would say that the US Roundtable has gone from strength to strength. I'm really impressed by the continuing commitment of the members in the US Roundtable. And it's coming from the producers, it's coming from the processors, it's coming from people who made commitments years ago that they're not willing to just give up on. And I see that in many countries. I'm a little bit more worried about the level of investment that's going into lower income countries, because that is being affected.
Yeah, thank you for the complex question, but I would try to answer starting from what Ash said. Of course, there is a risk, and the risk is high, because when there is conflicts or there is any big disruption like what we had with the pandemic, of course, the priorities from the government perspective may shift more to ensure food security as a first objective. But we know that methane is also a co-benefit, right? So by bringing action to address productivity, profitability, animal health, of course, we can also still keep methane within the priorities. The other aspect is what I said before, is mainly a collaboration. So collaboration and partnership is also another way to leverage and reduce those risks to cascade in that priority shift. For example, if you have private sector, producer organization leading the initiative or research, leading the initiative, you will have less pressure from the political risk. So that's usually what we see, and we also observe, for example, in terms of how we deal with the short-term risk versus our long-term commitment. But I can tell that despite what's going on, fertilizer prices going up and so on, during the discussion on the global plan of action on sustainable livestock transformation, members discussed a lot the priority number 4 on environment, climate, and biodiversity. And we could see the positive move that countries wanted to make a change, because livestock has been accused from the environmental angle, not on the productivity angle, actually from the environmental angle. That's why there is a good understanding within, especially from the government side, a good understanding that environmental sustainability and environmental performance of livestock sector must be improved. So I fear that we may have some disruption in the short term, but still our long-term goal, I think, doesn't shift, and that will continue. So I want also to mention that we need also to work with private sector and also international financial institutions and other local banks and so on, and to make sure that we build products that will incentivize farmers. Because we need to feel that market-based instrument, for example, premium prices, in there you have that, you have milk grading and so on. We have seen a country, if I give one on Japan, Japan had a big issue with food waste. And what they did in Japan was to build a new value chain where they use food waste actually as feed for pigs. And this policy shifted because government put a premium price for the product fed with what they call eco-feed. And so that was a way to shift, because of course they reduced emission from methane from the waste, because there was huge waste. And also they improved and they reduced actually the cost of feed, especially imported feed. So meaning that usually government can lead, but of course research we need to innovate, and the private sector need to scale, and farmers must adopt. So that's why, like, despite the risk, we believe that the long term still we are still on a good, let's say, on a good track. And I believe that, of course, there is another maybe aspect that we did not mention, is the reduction of the development finance. So we this year we lost around 50% of development funds. That's already a huge. So meaning that countries that relied on development aid will have difficulty to implement some of those decisions. So that's the reality. So it's a reality. So meaning that we need solutions that will be market driven. That's why, like, we need private sector to step in and cover that. Of course, that's would have different rules, but the role of private sector, international financial institutions will be very, very important to solve that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor before I do another combination of Slido? No. Okay, so maybe just to pick up on the finance issue, and you say the aid budget's dropped. So maybe to come back to the MRV and the carbon markets and the climate finance, there are a few questions relating to wanting to understand a bit more, like what specifically needs to be strengthened in the MRV systems. Now you've mentioned a bit about activity data and getting better activity data, but if you want to mention anything else, or any of you. And then the other question is, who's going to pay, right? So let's say we get good MRV systems and we have the framework for carbon markets. We're seeing budgets get constrained in the public sector, particularly on the development side. Thinking of climate finance and carbon markets, who will pay for the reductions? What are you seeing out there of willingness to pay from your engagement with governments, but also from our colleagues in the Roundtable and International Dairy Federation? What's the kind of state of the market, so to speak?
We'll start with this. So there is a value to that reduction in carbon, and it's important that that value goes to most of that value goes to the place that's reducing it. And when we look at the dairy value chain, 90+% of emissions are before the milk leaves the farm. And so if we're going to ask our dairy producers to be reducing emissions and asking them to implement practices and technology that comes with a cost, then there has to be recapture of that in some capacity. Some of these things have other values to them. There are things that may drive down methane emissions from the cow that could also improve productivity. So we don't necessarily have to capture everything from the marketplace, but there needs to be an opportunity for them to gain value from that. There's also a value for the actors in the dairy market chain to want to keep those reduced emissions within the dairy value chain. However, the value of those reductions right now might be worth much more to somebody else outside the sector. And we start running into some difficulties with helping to reward the producer for doing the right thing, but giving them less money because we want to keep it in the dairy value chain so that we as a sector can show that we're making those reductions, versus, say, people in the aviation industry that might pay a lot more money for it. That's a bad conundrum. And we don't have a good fix to that yet, as to how we demonstrate that we're reducing the overall emissions in the dairy value chain, but allowing the farmer to sell it outside the chain. Because in essence, you're letting the aviation sector borrow it for a period of time. But that value for the aviation sector is much higher, and they can pay more than, say, a fast food restaurant chain or a supermarket. So that is a very difficult issue, I think, in the carbon markets.
Yeah. So what we see is that, of course, there are different mechanisms on carbon markets. We can have the voluntary, like Jamie mentioned, especially when producers reduce emissions, they can sell either in setting, so within the value chain, or off settings. But we see also the Paris Agreement mechanism. So the Paris Agreement mechanism is providing two frameworks. One is the bilateral cooperation between countries, where a country that is a buyer and a country that is a seller do bilateral agreements, and they agree on the MRV system they will use, and of course they can transact directly between the two to contribute to the implementation of their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, right? So that is a mechanism that is some countries are kind of pushing toward that because it contributes mainly directly to the reporting. And usually the registries, so where those credits are registered and monitored, is usually within the national jurisdictions. So we see also the interest of different buyers, private sector mainly, and what they are asking now is integrity. So that's why MRV is important, because we have had crisis in the carbon market, especially from the forestry sector, that really collapsed the markets 2 years ago. And the issue was mainly the transparency in terms of data, and also emission reduction, the crediting approach, and so on. So now what I see where is moving, especially on the voluntary side, is mainly to make the system much more stronger, meaning digital, with traceability. But of course, that may exclude certain participants to participate in the market. So that's the small risk that is there, that the integrity will come with a certain exclusion, especially if you are talking about small-scale producers that are not recording their data. They are more using, let's say, more bulk of few data points across the systems. Those may be difficult to support. So, however, there are other mechanisms. That's what we call no-market mechanism. For example, the payment for results that the World Bank is doing, or the Green Climate Funds. What they do is mainly they support countries in investment in emission reductions, and then they get rewarded once the emissions are reduced. So once you demonstrate the results. So I can give a quick example with Mexico. Mexico recently completed a project on forestry, so around $60 million. And now that money is going to be reinvested in the livestock to reduce emission in livestock, especially deforestation-free livestock commodities, especially beef commodities. So with the green climate finance. So those are the kind of other mechanisms that are very important. So we don't see that producers may think about more the trending schemes, but should also think about the other opportunities, especially those no-market mechanisms that usually are supported by governments, and they are mainly directed to the result based. So that's I would say that's why MRV still plays a big role on that there. I think the other question was about which part of the MRV. Only maybe activity data. I would say not only activity data, but the whole ecosystem. So because it's a measurement, reporting, and verification. So all the steps should be transparent.
Yeah, exactly. We have a task force at the moment working on reporting and accounting methodology. And the issue there is that SPTI and GHG protocol have made it extremely difficult for any company in the food industry, basically, but certainly in the livestock industry, to actually measure and account for their reductions in a useful way that's actually going to demonstrate that they're making progress. So I think that's the first point. We need to solve some of these issues and so that we can actually report on what we're doing, because we're making progress.
Great. Okay, well, that brings it to a close. So thank you all for the questions, and please join me in thanking our panelists.